Hi everyone, this is chapter 8 and we'll be looking at surveys and questionnaires. So surveys and questionnaires are usually used interchangeably, so you may use surveys or call them questionnaires. They are used interchangeably by quantitative researchers. So that'll be our focus for today's. So firstly, surveys or questionnaires, they are the most commonly used quantitative method. And it's relatively easy to do and administer, as you would have seen from the textbook, or you might have already have experience participating in some form of survey. So surveys are means to collect usually quantitative data, so questions that are close-ended, and later on we'll look at what close-ended means and how that compares to open-ended questions. So oftentimes closed-ended questions giving you a set number of responses, possible responses, and you choose one of those possible options. So that's a relatively quick way to get participants to engage or to respond to the survey, and a fairly easy way to reach out to a large number of people. So surveys are very useful that way, helps us to understand our participants in a very quick way. We can ask a series of questions, but we also know that that also presents their own challenges. So we'll be looking at them in turn in today's class. Okay, what kind of surveys are there? What type or how do we deliver surveys, or what are the different ways that we can deliver surveys? So in this slide we see that there are different types. So the first one will be a self-reported survey. The self-reported surveys are probably the most common among all of these that we have on this slide. Well, self-reported or self-report surveys are surveys where the researchers have a set of questions, or either all printed out on a piece of paper, or available online. Like for example, Qualtrics. Many of us might have experience using Qualtrics or even SurveyMonkey. So those are examples of surveys, and those are self-reported. Reason because they are questions being asked on those surveys or the questionnaires. Respondents read the questions themselves. They think about what do they mean, what do the questions mean, and they look at the possible responses, the options given to them, and they choose the one that is closest or most accurately reflect their opinion or their views. So that self-reported is something that they say. So for example, say a self-report questionnaire asks, how much chocolate do you eat every week? Okay, and then maybe say there are 5 options. Option 1 says 0, option 2 says 1 piece of chocolate, and then it increments by 1 piece all the way to option number 5. So you choose one of those 5 options that most closely respond to your experience in consuming chocolate. So that's self-reported because it's oftentimes not verified, or quite difficult to verify. It's what the respondents say. Okay, so then we have self-report or self-reported surveys. Second type we have is the face-to-face. So it's the same thing, same idea, same set of questions on the survey, but instead of having the respondents read it themselves and then they themselves respond, we have an interviewer who would go up to a real participant and asks the participants those sets of questions, tells the participants what the options are, and then takes down what the participants' responses are. So it's more like an interview. The interviewer or the researcher will ask the questions, the participants' responses will respond, and then the interviewer takes down the responses. So it's more face to face. It looks more like an interview, and you can imagine that it takes up more time because you can't just send it to the masses and expect people to respond. If you're doing a face to face survey, you need people who are on the ground to do the surveys. So that takes up time, takes up resources. So that's the downside. But the positive thing about it, the advantage of doing face to face surveys, is that you can increase your response rate because we have actual people on the ground interacting with the actual participants that we want to find out information on. So response rates will be higher, but as we said, downside will be increased amount of resources invested in interviewing the participants. Next, we have phone surveys. So phone surveys similar to face because you still involve some active data collection from the researchers. So cost and time, resources investment, those are high. Those are the downside. But again, of it is that you can increase your response rate, so it's much better. More people are going to respond because you're directly interacting with them. Another distinct advantage of phone surveys is that you can reach a wider geographical distance. So instead of needing someone on the ground to knock on every door in the neighborhood, you can actually call people who are much further away from you. So that will be very effective if a researcher needs to know how participants respond in different parts of this country or very geographically dispersed um, space. So that's a distinct advantage of phone survey. Next, we have online survey, and we kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier. So the benefit of it, again, benefit is that you can have a lot of time efficiency, just like the self-report survey. You can send out a mass email to lots of people with a link that they can click on, and then they can complete the Qualtrics or complete the Survey Monkey. So it's very cost efficient, it's time efficient. Downside is because you don't have that face-to-face interaction, direct engagement between the researcher and the participants, your response rate will probably be much lower. So think about that. That makes sense because for most of us, when we receive emails that ask us to participate in surveys, we probably may not respond to all of them. And maybe perhaps when we want to respond to them, that might be a few days or a few weeks later, and we might have forgotten or the deadline has passed. So we miss doing it. So that could be a downside of online survey. So finally on this slide, we see there is a mail survey. What's this type? So the mail survey is just the same thing, the same set of questions and options, possible responses that participants can give. Everything is printed on pieces of paper, put in an envelope, sent to participants' homes. So they receive it at home, they can respond to it, and then mail it back to the researchers. So again, what's the benefit? Benefit is that you can reach the geographically dispersed populations similar to your phone survey. It doesn't require a lot of labor, not labor intensive, because you can have it mailed out. You can have companies do that for you. Response rate could be low because it depends on whether the mail get delivered and whether people want to open it and respond to the survey. So each of these 5 types of surveys that we have possible options, they have ups and downs, pros and cons. It depends on what your research design is and what kind of response rate is needed. And that's pretty much the next slide. Let's take a look on the next. So which is the best method to reach out to your population based on the different types that we saw on the previous slide? It really depends on what's the reach. If you are doing if a researcher is doing a survey that is about Houston, people in Houston, so any of those options can be pretty good. You don't have to prioritize mail or phone surveys because it's easy to reach out to people if you are just very restricted in your geographical location, say Houston. But if you're wanting to reach out to participants across the country, then options like online survey, mail survey, phone survey, those will be probably more applicable because it gives the researcher the ability to reach out to people who are much further away from the researcher. Okay, and how would a survey influence response rate, as we talked about in the previous slide? When you have the researcher who contacts the participants directly, interacting with them directly and asking them, there is this survey that I need you to help with. It pertains to topic X. Would you be willing to give me a few minutes to answer a few questions? So when you have that direct interactions, usually the response rate can go up, not always guaranteed, but more or less it will be higher than, say, the mail survey or the online survey. All right. Designing a survey. So here's the first slide to this section of this chapter. Designing of a survey has to suit the research design. What is the emphasis of the research question or hypothesis? How does the survey help to support the researcher to gather the data that he or she needs? Okay, questions should be as straightforward as possible, meaning to say should be as not ambiguous as possible. Simple, direct questions that usually just ask one single thing and then have the respondents respond instead of having multiple questions embedded in one question. So making it simple, making it straightforward, easy for respondents to read, to understand, and to respond. We have to take the population into consideration as we think about which surveys to send out, because the surveys have to serve the purpose of gathering data pertinent to the population that the researcher is interested in. So those are some considerations that the researcher has to take into account in designing the survey, the delivery of the survey, as we saw in 2 slides ago. Okay, the survey should be reliable and valid, and we saw that in chapter 5 when we look at reliability and validity. The participants' responses, if they were to respond, the researcher, as he or she collects those responses, has to analyze those responses in the context as the questions were asked, and not to skew the responses in a way that favors the researcher's perspective or agenda. So it's important that the researcher reports honestly and transparently, truthfully about the participants' response in the context of the questions being asked to the participants. And that leads to point number 6. When survey results are reported in that fashion that I've talked about, it means that the researcher has reported the findings or the results accurately and ethically. And those are important elements, as we have learned from previous chapters, because people or consumers of research reports, they actually apply the learnings or the findings from those reports. So we have an obligation to make sure that our findings are concrete, are solid, are truthful, are accurate, because people who read those research materials, they will use it, they will apply it for future research, or they apply it directly to a context that's applicable. So we have that ethical obligation. Do we write our own questionnaires or survey questions? The answer is ideally, if there is a suitable or validated survey, then we will use that. So what that means is that the researcher has to be familiar with the literature, knows the topic well, knows what kind of surveys have been used to study a certain topic. And if the survey has been validated, the researcher should attempt to gain access to that questionnaire, that set of questionnaire, and then use it because it's been validated, it has been used before. On the other hand, if the surveys that exist, that already exist, are not adequate, or maybe they don't exist, then the researcher has to create his or her questions for the surveys. If that were to happen, then the researcher has to ensure that the survey items or the questions on the survey should be straightforward. So again, simple, answers one complete question in one complete sentence, not multiple possible questions or directions in one single question. So to help the respondents to understand the question more easily. That also allows responses to be easily done, especially when the researcher has to provide multiple options in cases such as the closed-ended um, surveys. We should also avoid abbreviations or short forms. Um, Reason because the participants may not be familiar with those expressions. So ideally, we spell out all the words, the whole expression, so that to help participants understand the questions. Shorter is usually better than longer in terms of questions and as well as the actual survey. If we can reduce a survey of many questions down to the most essential ones, that will be key because it helps to maintain high response rate, and it helps in ensuring that participants actually complete the survey and return it to the researcher. All right, so let's see what next slide. Closed-ended questions or closed questions. So closed questions are questions where the respondents have limited number of possible responses. So the responses that they can potentially give are limited with a set number. So previously we studied what Likert type scales are. Likert type scales usually have 7 possible options, sometimes 5, sometimes 9, but usually 7. So that's a closed-ended question where participants' responses are limited with a 7-point scale, for example, and they will have to choose one of the 7 that closely aligns with their their views or most accurately responding to their views. Okay, so giving those responses a numerical value 1 through 7 of those 7-point scale. And this is a recap of what we have studied before about categorical and nominal responses. So categorical or nominal responses are exhaustive, reason because the options presented to the participants are complete. Everything that is possible to be represented in the responses, they are all there. They're mutually exclusive, meaning to say there is no in between. They are very clear categories. So for example, undergraduate years, there's freshman, sophomore, junior, and seniors. So there are all those 4 categories, 4 levels of undergraduate. They're mutually exclusive. It's one of the 4, okay? And when we say equivalent categorical responses, that means that each of the possible categories are equal. There's no better or worse, stronger or weaker, nothing of that kind of gradual change or increment. So unlike say um, something that is ordered in a way that represents strength or rank, not categorical nominal responses are equivalent. So when we say things like what is your sex, male or female, there's no better or worse, it's just reporting information. Okay, like a type scale, we talked about that a little bit earlier. Usually 7-point scale, but sometimes it might be 5, sometimes even 9. 9 might be less frequent than 5, 7 is the most frequent. The middle option is usually the neutral option, so participants can choose the middle option. So say choose 4 out of a 7-point scale. If the participant feels neutral about things, about that question, don't really lean either way, that is a pretty safe response. And the semantic differential scale, same thing, it also comes with a 7-point scale usually, that's frequently. But what's different about semantic differential scales is that they use 2 extreme adjectives usually to compare. So for example, on one end we can have friendly, and then on the other extreme, friendly to represent the other end of that spectrum. And then there will be a 7-point scale. Participant can choose between 1 and 7 to represent the response of either unfriendly or friendly. So there we have possible ways to respond to closed questions or closed-ended questions. On the flip side, we have the open-ended questions or open questions. So these are questions where respondents can get to respond using their own words. It's open-ended. They can respond in however many words they want, in however amount of detail or depth of the response. So we are really interested to hear what they have to say. We're not limiting them to any kind of options like the 7-point scale. So the downside to that is that it makes data analysis more challenging because it's hard to compare. We don't have concrete categories like our closed-ended questions. So it's much more difficult, but on the other hand, it makes data analysis more interesting because we have a richer set of data. We have people who can respond in the way that they believe is appropriate or in adequate depth for the question being asked of them. So there's definitely the positive advantage of using open-ended questions. Open-ended questions can also help be useful when we cue our participants to a certain topic and then let them run with the idea and to respond based on how they think about it, um, giving them the space and time to develop their answer and not be constrained by the options. So that's very useful because then we get to hear the full range of possible responses, and that helps us to learn, really, for us, the researchers, to learn how participants think about the questions that we ask them. The design of the flow of the survey is crucial because it has to make some kind of sense. It must flow from, say, the most simple or the broadest, the most general view on that topic and then down to the more specific. So, for example, say chocolate. We might ask participants how often they eat chocolate. If a participant doesn't eat chocolate, then it doesn't quite make sense to ask the most specific questions at the start of the survey. We have to move from the more general down to the more specific. Okay, so say the response say yes, I eat chocolate, and then they tell us how frequent they eat chocolate, and then we might ask more specific questions like what kind of brand do you like, what kind of flavor, usually what time of the day do you eat chocolate, how frequent do you eat it, do you eat it with other kinds of food or beverages or with friends and things like that. So we move from general to specific, so the flow makes sense, make it easy for the participant to respond, and it makes sense, and it helps, and it's always very nice to say a big thank you to respondents for their time and their contributions for participating in the research. Before we use the surveys on the participants that we want to learn from, it's always a good idea to pre-test the survey, especially if the survey is not validated. And when we pre-test the survey, we call it pilot testing. Okay, we pilot test a set of the questions or maybe a subset of the questions to see how people of a similar characteristic to our participants or the population we're interested in, how would they respond. So we're giving a try, we see how they respond, how they react. Do the questions make sense? Are there words that are too ambiguous or words that the participants are unfamiliar with? So we try to tweak it before we apply the real survey on the participants that are from the population that we actually want to collect data from. Several ways we can pre-test our surveys, and there are 4 of them that we can see right here. The first type of pre-testing or pilot testing of the survey is called a cognitive approach. The cognitive approach is done when the researcher does the pre-testing face-to-face, preferably, but usually done face-to-face with a participant or a person who has the characteristic of the population that we're interested in. Okay, then the researcher observes the nonverbals and the expressions or any kind of feedback that the researcher can gather as he or she asks those questions. We're seeing how the respondent respond before answering or during the respondent was listening to the question, as well as how the respondent respond. Did they shift? Did they look uncomfortable? Did they take a long pause because they might not understand, or maybe they're processing the answer? So using that as a cognitive approach one-on-one, face-to-face, usually to see how a respondent will respond. Okay, so it's easier to compare 1 and 3 before we come back to 2. So if we understand the first approach, the cognitive approach, then the behavioral approach or the behavioral coding is a bit easier. The behavioral coding is a similar approach like the cognitive approach, but it is taken from a third party's perspective. So instead of the researcher who was doing the face-to-face questioning or presenting the questions to the participant, there is another individual, another researcher who is part of the research team, observes externally. So this person is not part of the testing process, but this person is outside of the process, watching in, looking in into how the researcher is asking the questions and how the participant is responding. So based on this third party external view, this researcher takes notes and identifies ways to revise the survey. Okay, so let's go back to the second approach. The second approach is the conventional approach, and by doing so, the researcher basically just sends out the survey that he or she has designed or is going to use, send it to several people who are similar to the individuals in the population of interest, and then just see how they respond. So this is probably the easier way, but it means that you're using up some of the individuals that could have been the individuals who will give you the data that you want to collect. So it's easier, it's more conventional, but it means that you're depleting possible people, because usually, most often than not, these individuals who participate in your pilot testing for your conventional approach, you cannot use these people again to collect the actual data. So this is a good approach, but it also has its disadvantage. Fourth approach, the expert panel. So the expert panel brings in individuals or experts who are known to be the experts of research methods, or they might have a very particular insight to the survey's content, so they know the survey content very well. We have this panel of experts review the survey questions and then provide their feedback on how the survey questions should be revised or tweaked. So these are the 4 approaches to pretest your surveys. A note on sample size and response rate. So these two things are not the same. Okay, sample size and response rate are not the same thing. Sample size is the size that you would like your sample to be, whereas response rate is the rate that people respond. So for example, if you say we send out 100 surveys to people in the neighborhood and we receive 65 completed surveys, that means our response rate was 65%. Okay, perhaps we wanted a survey of the sample size much larger than 65, so we will probably have to send out much more than 100 surveys to potential participants. So here we see sample size and response rate, they are two different things. Okay, so don't get them mixed up. Different types of surveys, the ones that I looked at previously, like the online survey or mail or phone or face-to-face, they will yield different kinds of response rates. So depending on the response rate that we're looking for, that is acceptable, we'll use different of those survey types. There are factors for us to consider in our determination of which type of survey design to use. And we also have to factor in that there are unusable responses. So what does that mean? It means that so back to the example, say the initial 100 surveys that we mail out to the neighborhood, we received 65 back, and of the 65, 5 of the surveys people didn't answer all the questions. Maybe they answered half of the questions. So that means that survey, that single response, cannot be used. Reason because it's incomplete. Participants did not complete responding, or did not at least attempt to respond to the majority of the questions on that survey. So because it's incomplete, it's usually unusable, and so even though we have that person responded, they mail back the survey, but it's incomplete, we cannot use it. So that means the usable data goes down further. All right. Survey reliability and validity. A very quick recap of things that we've spent tremendous amount of time talking in chapter 5. Chromebox alpha is used to determine whether the survey that we have is highly reliable or not. So the range is between 0 and 1. When it's 0, it means that the items on the survey do not have internal consistency. So which means to say the items are not very clear, they don't really measure the same thing. On the other end, if it's 1, it means that the items, they measure in a very similar fashion, similar construct that the researchers want to study, but 1 is almost impossible to achieve because perfect internal reliability is pretty rare. So what social science, especially communication research, usually find acceptable will be a 0.7. 0.7 response, 0.7 alpha, pretty good. That means it's acceptable, the scale is usable, and pretty accurate. Recap of the 3 types of validity. We saw that in chapter 5, but recap, content validity refers to the degree to which the items in the measuring device, so we're talking about the survey or the questionnaire, they represent the full range of characteristics or attitudes associated with the construct of interest. Okay, so the central idea, the central phenomenon that we're interested in, so say chocolate consumption. Okay, face validity refers to or is something that is achieved when the items on the survey reference the construct that we want to measure. So on the face of it, reading the questions, just reading it at first glance, the questions make sense that they're asking about chocolate consumption again, for example. Construct validity is achieved when the survey measures the core concept that was intended to be measured and not something else. So if a survey is about chocolate consumption, then it makes sense that the questions on there are all about chocolate, revolving around chocolate. It'll be very random if a question asks about carrot or broccoli consumption. Okay, so that's completely not aligned with the core concept, which is chocolate. So then if it's all mostly chocolate and the questions have strong internal validity, we also achieve construct validity. So when we collect our data, after we have collected our data, people responded, we have all data assembled, it's important that the researcher reports the data comprehensively as a complete set, so not cherry picking any of those data set or subset of the data set, but in combination of all of it to provide the most complete picture of what the data that has been collected. Okay. Oftentimes, if it's a survey, interpretations are limited to descriptive purposes. Reason because, especially if it pertains to close-ended questions, because when respondents respond, they are limited in how they respond because of the Likert type skills that we use. So it's more descriptive. Okay. And on the other hand, when we have open questions, it allows a more deeper analysis of a wide range of response. So we can then categorize our content, analyze the written response or verbal response that we get from our participants. Okay, so data that's obtained from close-ended questions allow us to do more of a descriptive statistics, more interpretive of the data based on on description. So say of the people who responded, 75% say they eat chocolate at least 3 times a week. So that's a very descriptive way of digesting or synthesizing the data, summarizing the data. On the other hand, the open-ended questions, they give us a wider range of responses, so we can then look at the nuances more carefully and more intently. And finally, we see that when we use survey data, it allows us to not just do descriptive analysis, which sometimes can be more straightforward, but it allows us also to test existing models. So models are theoretical constructs that researchers gather and put together, that presents or try to theorize possible sequences of things or events, and by their sequencing, their theorizing of those events, we can collect those data through surveys to see if the models or their theorizing are accurate or how accurately they reflect real world observations. So there you have, in today's class we see that surveys and questionnaires, they are the most common way that quantitative researchers use. We think about how you will have to think about different forms of data collection, types of surveys to suit the research design, what kind of questions or how do we ask our questions, open or close questions, how we might do analysis of data collected from surveys. And that wraps up the chapter on surveys and questionnaires.